The first sound wasn't the judge's voice. It was laughter. My husband leaned slightly toward his mistress, close enough that I could see the corner of his mouth curve upward, confident and relaxed, as if this were a private joke he was letting the rest of the courtroom overhear. He whispered something to her, slow and deliberate. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the meaning, but she answered anyway, her laugh soft, amused, certain. "It's over," he murmured. "You lost." She smiled without looking at me. "Did you really think you'd win?" They laughed again, not loud, not disruptive, just enough to be unmistakable. A few heads turned. Someone near the back shifted in their seat. The sound didn't belong in that room, and everyone felt it. Laughter in a divorce court isn't joy. It's a declaration. It says the outcome has already been decided. I said nothing. I didn't look at them. I didn't straighten my posture or lift my chin or do any of the things people expect from a woman who is about to lose everything in public. I kept my hands folded in my lap and stared straight ahead, as if I were listening to something only I could hear. The judge lowered his gaze to the file in front of him. He turned a page, then another. The room went quiet. When he looked up, he didn't look at my husband. He didn't look at his attorney. He looked directly at me. And then he called my name. In that moment, before anything else was said, I knew the laughter had come too early. What they didn't understand was that this hearing was never just about the end of a marriage. It was about who would be believed when the story stopped being convenient. I sat at my table alone. No family behind me, no hand on my shoulder, no whispered reassurance. Across the aisle, my husband's side was arranged like a finished picture. His attorney leaned back, composed. His sister sat 2 rows behind him, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me with something close to satisfaction. His mistress looked relaxed, almost bored, as if this were a formality she had already moved past. Everyone assumed I knew what was coming. They thought I was here to watch my life be divided, reduced, and signed away in neat legal language. They thought I was here to be emotional, defensive, unprepared, another woman who stayed too long and waited too late. They were wrong. If I lost today, I wouldn't just lose money. I wouldn't just lose access or standing or whatever scraps people like to argue over in a divorce court. I would lose the last thing that still carried my name without qualification. The one piece of authority that hadn't already been quietly reassigned while I was being told to be patient. They believed I didn't know that. From the way my husband sat, you would have thought he was attending a meeting he'd already won. He didn't look at me once. He didn't need to. In his mind, this hearing was the final step in a process that had been settled long before we entered the room. His mistress leaned toward him again, her voice low but careless now. She didn't bother hiding it. She had the posture of someone who believed the outcome belonged to her future, not mine. What made it worse wasn't the betrayal, it was the certainty. Certainty like that doesn't come from hope, it comes from preparation. They thought they understood me. They thought I was predictable, the kind of woman who keeps the peace, who avoids scenes, who believes things will work out if she just stays reasonable long enough. And for a long time that was true. I had let that image settle around me because it was easier than correcting it, easier than explaining that silence isn't the same thing as surrender, that restraint isn't confusion, that listening can be more dangerous than speaking. The judge shifted in his chair and adjusted the papers in front of him. The sound was small, but in that room it landed hard. My husband straightened slightly, still confident, but less relaxed now. His attorney leaned forward, ready to continue where he believed the story was going. I didn't move. I wasn't watching them anymore. I was watching the judge's hands, the way he paused over one page longer than the others, the way his expression changed. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice yet, but just enough for me to recognize it. This wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. They thought this hearing was about closing a chapter, about tying up loose ends, about making sure I left quietly and without complications. They didn't know that years earlier, long before anyone thought about divorce or courtrooms or final hearings, I had made a decision that never stopped mattering. a decision that connected my name to something they had grown used to controlling without me. They assumed that because I wasn't arguing, I had nothing left. They assumed wrong. When the judge spoke again, his voice was calm, professional, measured. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. He said my name once more. And as the room turned toward me, as my husband finally looked up with faint irritation, as his mistress's smile stalled just slightly, I understood something with absolute clarity. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand how I became the woman they thought would lose. Years earlier, before courtrooms and silence and that carefully controlled laughter, my life moved at a pace that felt ordinary and safe. We met at a community fundraiser I hadn't planned to attend. I'd agreed to help a friend at the last minute, the kind of favor you say yes to without thinking because it feels harmless. He was already there when I arrived, standing near the back of the room, speaking quietly with two people who kept nodding as if his words carried weight. He wasn't charming in an obvious way. He didn't try to be. What stood out was how easily the space bent around him. When we were introduced, he listened more than he talked. That alone made him feel different. He asked thoughtful questions, the kind that make you feel seen rather than evaluated. I remember thinking he seemed grounded, capable, someone who handled responsibility without announcing it. I was stable then, not flashy, not struggling. I had a life that fit me, a routine I trusted. I didn't need rescuing, and I wasn't looking to be absorbed into someone else's world. That, I later realized, was part of what made me seem safe to him. He was used to being deferred to, used to decisions landing on his side of the table. I didn't challenge that, not because I couldn't, but because there was nothing yet to challenge. At the beginning, deference felt like cooperation, like respect. When his family entered the picture, they welcomed me warmly. Too warmly, maybe, but I didn't know that then. I was praised for being easygoing, for not making things complicated, for understanding how demanding his life could be. I was told how refreshing it was to meet someone who didn't need to be the center of attention. I took those words as compliments. Looking back, I can see the shape of the expectation forming. I was being slotted into a role that already existed, one that required flexibility, patience, and silence. At the time, it felt like belonging. The first small decision that tied my life more closely to his came quietly. He needed help managing a situation that had grown more complex than he expected. Nothing dramatic, just something that required time, discretion, and trust. I agreed without hesitation, not because I was pressured, but because partnership, to me, meant stepping in when things mattered. I didn't frame it as a sacrifice, I framed it as alignment. That choice changed the way my days unfolded. My schedule began to orbit his obligations. His priorities became shared priorities. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, almost polite in the way it took over. I stopped noticing where my time ended and his began. People started introducing me in relation to him, his wife, his support, his anchor. I didn't correct them because I believed the foundation was solid enough to hold us both. There were moments early on that could have warned me, small ones. He would answer questions directed at me just to keep things moving. He would suggest handling paperwork himself because it was simpler. He would reassure me that details didn't matter as much as trust. I believed him. When his family deferred decisions to him, I didn't feel excluded. I felt protected. When they spoke about long-term plans without looking in my direction, I told myself they were just used to an old rhythm. I didn't see how often my name was left out because I wasn't looking for it. The truth is, nothing was taken from me at first. I offered it, my time, my flexibility, my willingness to smooth over rough edges. I believed that what I contributed, quietly and consistently, would always be recognized, even if it wasn't always acknowledged. I didn't document things. I didn't keep records. I trusted verbal assurances because I trusted the people giving them. Love, I thought, made receipts unnecessary. That belief wasn't naive, it was human. The first time I felt a flicker of unease, I dismissed it almost immediately. A document passed across the table without my name on it. A decision finalized before I'd been consulted. When I asked, casually, I was told it was an oversight. That it didn't change anything. That it was just easier this way. I accepted the explanation because accepting it preserved peace. There's a particular kind of silence that feels like maturity. It tells you you're being reasonable, that you're choosing the bigger picture over ego. I mistook that silence for wisdom. I didn't realize I was training everyone around me to believe my absence didn't change outcomes. By the time I noticed how fully my life had folded into his, it was already considered normal, expected. People spoke as if I had always been there, but rarely as if I needed to be consulted. What I couldn't see yet was how that expectation would harden, how flexibility would become obligation, how patience would be reinterpreted as compliance. I believed then that stability was proof of strength, that being steady meant being secure. I didn't know that the very qualities that made me trustworthy were the ones that made me easy to underestimate. And I didn't yet understand that the woman sitting quietly in that courtroom years later was only there because of the choices I made when I believed partnership was protection. The change didn't arrive with an argument or a clear line I could point to later. It arrived quietly, disguised as efficiency. Months passed, and what I had once offered willingly began to be assumed. Requests no longer sounded like questions. Gratitude faded, replaced by expectation. My availability was treated as a given, something that existed independently of my consent. I noticed it, but I told myself this was what commitment looked like when things became serious. On the surface, life was stable. Our days followed predictable patterns. From the outside, we looked aligned, functional, even enviable. Inside, I was carrying more than I realized, smoothing over problems before they reached him, handling delicate situations that required patience and discretion. I became the person who absorbed tension so others didn't have to feel it. Most of what I did left no paper trail. I managed logistics, mediated family conflicts, handled sensitive conversations that no one wanted their name attached to. When something went wrong, I fixed it quietly. When something went right, it simply became the new standard. I was told more than once that paperwork between people who trusted each other was unnecessary, that formalizing things implied doubt. I believed that. Love, I thought, didn't need documentation. Commitment was proven through consistency, not signatures. His family reinforced that belief without ever saying it outright. At gatherings, I was praised for being supportive, adaptable, understanding. Publicly, I was celebrated as the steady presence who kept everything balanced. Privately, I was reminded to stay flexible, to avoid rocking the boat, to let him handle decisions because he was better suited for them. There was an unspoken hierarchy, and I fit neatly into it. My opinions were welcomed as long as they aligned with what had already been decided. When they didn't, the conversation moved on without friction, as if my input had simply been a courtesy. Someone once referred to me as a stabilizing influence, and everyone nodded. At the time, I felt proud of that description. I didn't understand that stability in their language meant predictability. It meant I could be relied upon not to disrupt the system. The first time I noticed my name missing, I almost laughed it off. It was a document related to something I had helped manage from the beginning. I scanned it quickly, assuming I had missed my own reference, but it wasn't there. No acknowledgement, no signature line, just decisions finalized without me. I asked about it casually, not wanting to sound defensive. He didn't look up from what he was doing when he answered. He said it didn't matter, that it was easier to keep things streamlined, that involving me officially would only complicate things. I accepted that explanation because it allowed everything to continue smoothly. I told myself it was an oversight, not a pattern. I told myself I was being practical, not sidelined. I told myself that speaking up would create unnecessary conflict, and conflict would only distract from what we were trying to build. Silence felt responsible. It felt adult. It felt like choosing the long view over ego. What I didn't see yet was how silence always benefits someone, and it wasn't me. As time went on, the demands increased. More responsibility landed on my shoulders, but with less acknowledgement attached to it. Decisions were made faster, with fewer explanations. Control was framed as efficiency. "I'll handle that" slowly turned into, "Let me decide." Friends drifted away without any dramatic fallout. I was busy, always busy. My time was no longer entirely my own, but it felt selfish to notice that. After all, I was part of something bigger now. That's what I told myself. There were moments when something in his tone made me pause. Casual comments about protecting assets. Jokes about how people who didn't need to know details were happier that way. Statements that suggested transparency was optional, not essential. Each time I felt a flicker of discomfort, and each time I buried it. I didn't want to be the person who questioned motives where there was no obvious threat. Looking back, that was the first mistake. The shift from partner to function didn't happen overnight. It happened through repetition, through being useful, through being reliable, through being the person who never demanded credit or clarification. I became part of the infrastructure, not the leadership, necessary but not visible, essential but replaceable. There was a moment, much later, when I would realize that my role had changed from asset to liability. But at the time, I was still operating under the assumption that loyalty was mutual, that contribution was remembered, that presence mattered even when it wasn't acknowledged. I didn't know yet that my willingness to carry weight quietly was being interpreted as permission to remove me when it became convenient. I believed that sacrifice, when made in good faith, protected you. I was wrong. And by the time that truth became impossible to ignore, the groundwork for my erasure had already been laid. I didn't learn about the other woman in a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation, no trembling confession, no tearful apology. I learned about her the way you learn about most inconvenient truths, through fragments that refused to stay quiet. A name that appeared too often, a message that ended too abruptly, a shift in tone when certain topics came up. At first, I didn't react, not because I didn't care, but because the information didn't land the way betrayal usually does. It felt incomplete, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't yet explain the picture. When I finally saw her, it was almost underwhelming. She was confident, yes, but not calculating. Attractive, but not magnetic. She moved through the room as someone reacting to circumstances, not directing them. She laughed easily, spoke freely, and mirrored his energy without shaping it. That was when I understood something important. If this were only about her, none of what followed would have happened. The affair wasn't hidden. That was the strange part. He stopped apologizing, stopped explaining. He let me know just enough to destabilize me, then watched what I would do with that information. The ambiguity was intentional. It kept me off balance without forcing a confrontation. He wasn't trying to repair anything. He was measuring how much I would tolerate. And while I was processing the emotional impact, something else was happening quietly alongside it. Someone else had begun to speak where he hesitated. At first it was subtle. Advice offered casually, suggestions framed as concern, a steady voice that stepped in whenever conversations drifted toward uncertainty. This person didn't raise their voice, didn't accuse or defend. They spoke in language that sounded procedural, reasonable, almost kind. They didn't react to the affair, they used it. I noticed the pattern in hindsight, how decisions were suddenly justified with phrases like best practice and standard outcomes, how my emotional response was gently repositioned as a liability, how concern for fairness was reframed as resistance to reality. There was a conversation that changed everything for me. We were alone, sitting across from each other in a space that had once felt neutral. I was told calmly that situations like this followed predictable paths. That escalation rarely benefited anyone, that being reasonable now would make things easier later. Easier for whom wasn't specified. I was warned without threat that pushing back could complicate matters, that labels had a way of sticking once they were applied. Emotional, uncooperative, difficult. The words were soft, but the message was cold. In that moment, I felt something shift, not pain, not anger, recognition. This wasn't about repairing a marriage, this was about managing exposure. The other woman, I realized, benefited from this structure without understanding it. She believed she had been chosen. She moved with the confidence of someone who thought she was stepping into a future that had been prepared for her. What she didn't know was that her certainty wasn't hers. It had been handed to her. She repeated phrases that didn't sound like her own. She spoke with a confidence that felt borrowed, rehearsed. She believed outcomes had already been decided because someone else had decided them. I watched her carefully, not with jealousy, but with clarity. People who think they're winning rarely notice they're being positioned. Around the same time, the narrative about me began to change. I wasn't described as supportive anymore. I was described as emotional, concerned, too close to the situation to be objective. My history of managing complexity was minimized, my contributions reframed as involvement rather than competence. Friends who had once been neutral grew distant. Conversations became careful. Silence replaced curiosity. I stopped trying to correct the story. Instead, I listened. There was a phrase I heard for the first time in passing, spoken casually as if it were a logistical step rather than a human one. Exit strategy, clean break, timeline. It wasn't said to me, it wasn't meant for me. It floated through a conversation as if my presence were already theoretical. That was the moment I understood the affair wasn't the rupture. It was the distraction. While I was expected to react emotionally, to argue or plead or demand explanations, the real work was being done elsewhere. Plans were being formalized, roles reassigned, outcomes assumed. They weren't responding to chaos, they were executing a plan. Once I understood that, I stopped reacting to the affair entirely. It no longer held my attention. What mattered was the system that had formed around it, the structure that had turned a personal betrayal into a strategic maneuver. I didn't confront anyone, I didn't accuse or demand answers, I didn't reveal what I had begun to see. I let them believe I was still focused on the wrong threat. Because the moment you understand you're being positioned as the problem is the moment you stop trying to fix the relationship and start paying attention to the rules. And by the time I heard the word exit again, spoken with casual confidence, I knew something else with absolute certainty. They weren't planning whether I would leave. They were planning how quietly. The shift didn't announce itself with a fight or a threat. It arrived disguised as routine. One day, decisions were simply made without me. Meetings happened that I learned about afterward. Timelines changed without explanation. At first, I assumed it was oversight, the kind that happens when life gets busy and people move too quickly. But the feeling it left behind wasn't confusion. It was exclusion. What unsettled me most was how calm it all seemed. There was no anger in his voice when I asked questions, no defensiveness, just a steady reassurance that everything was under control, that there was no need for concern. The tone suggested competence, not concealment, and that made it harder to challenge. The moment denial broke came quietly. I tried to access something I had always handled without issue. It wasn't dramatic. No error message flashing red, no confrontation. Just a polite denial of access, as if the system itself had decided I no longer belonged there. I waited before saying anything. When I did, I kept my voice neutral. I asked whether there had been a change I wasn't aware of. He didn't hesitate. He explained that things were being streamlined, that it was temporary, that this was how situations like ours were usually handled. He used words like procedure and efficiency, as if invoking policy could turn a personal removal into an impersonal necessity. I listened and something inside me went cold. It wasn't the explanation itself that made things worse. It was how prepared it sounded. This wasn't a response crafted in the moment. It was a script. When I pushed gently, not accusing, just clarifying, the tone shifted slightly. I was told I was too close to the situation, that my perspective might be clouded by emotion, that it would be better if I trusted the process rather than questioning it. Trust, I realized, was being redefined as compliance. The phrase, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," was delivered without malice. But it carried weight. It implied consequence without naming it. Cooperation was framed as maturity, resistance as instability. That was when I stopped believing the story I was being told. I began to see the pattern. Access removed here. Decisions finalized there. always small enough to explain away on their own, but together forming a shape I couldn't ignore. Each change reduced my visibility. Each adjustment positioned me further from authority. And the timing was never accidental. These shifts coincided with milestones, legal consultations, financial planning sessions I was no longer invited to. Moments when certainty mattered more than collaboration. This wasn't fallout from emotional betrayal. It was preparation. I didn't confront him with that realization, not yet. Confrontation would have accelerated whatever timeline they were working with. It would have signaled awareness, and awareness was the one thing they couldn't afford me having too soon. I understood instinctively that once I showed my hand, the pace would change. So I chose silence, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of delay. I let them believe the explanations worked. I nodded when reassured. I stepped back when asked. Outwardly, I appeared tired, resigned, even relieved to let others take control. Inside, I was watching everything. The other woman became bolder during this time. Her confidence grew in proportion to my retreat. She moved through shared spaces as if the future had already been allocated to her. She spoke about plans without hesitation, as if my absence were a formality that simply hadn't been processed yet. She used his language, phrases repeated word for word, certainty delivered with borrowed authority. It was clear she had been told a version of the story where I was already gone. That realization didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It clarified things. If she believed the outcome was sealed, it meant someone had convinced her it was, and that someone was not improvising. The moment that truly changed everything came when I heard a word I hadn't heard before, spoken casually, without caution. Transition. It came up in a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of, referenced as if it were a logistical phase rather than a personal rupture. A transition period, a transition plan, a transition window. No one spoke my name. They weren't discussing whether I would leave. They were discussing how smoothly it would happen. That was when I understood the scale of what I was facing. This wasn't about hurt feelings or betrayal alone. This was a coordinated effort to remove me quietly, efficiently, and without disruption. And in that moment, something else became clear. They believed I wouldn't notice until it was over. They believed I would react emotionally, too late, with nothing but outrage and disbelief. They believed I would demand explanations instead of understanding systems. They believed silence meant ignorance. They were wrong. From that point on, I stopped asking questions that gave away what I knew. I stopped correcting inaccuracies. I stopped trying to be included. I watched. I listened. I paid attention to timing, language, and assumption. I learned where confidence turned careless and where certainty hid gaps. The day I realized they were planning my exit was the day I stopped thinking about saving the marriage. It was the day I started thinking about timing. I stopped asking questions because every question gave them information. At first, the silence felt unnatural. I was used to clarifying, smoothing, explaining. But I learned quickly that explanations invite negotiation, and negotiation reveals priorities. So I went quiet in a way that looked like exhaustion, not strategy. I nodded. I deferred. I let decisions pass without comment. They relaxed. My husband mistook my calm for resignation. His tone softened, not with kindness, but with relief. The pressure to perform certainty lifted from his shoulders. He no longer measured his words around me. He spoke freely, assuming I was no longer tracking the details that mattered. Silence became my cover. I began listening the way you listen when you're not waiting to respond. I listened to cadence, to repetition, to the words people choose when they believe the room belongs to them. I listened for what was said when I was presumed distracted, when they thought my attention had moved on. The language changed first. They stopped saying we. They started saying moving forward. Conversations shifted from feelings to timelines, from possibilities to procedures. Legal terms slipped into casual speech, the way they do when someone has rehearsed them enough times to forget they sound out of place. I noticed patterns in schedules, calls taken in hallways, meetings arranged quickly, then rescheduled just as quickly, documents placed carefully on counters instead of left casually on tables. phones turned face down with intention, not habit. I didn't react, I cataloged. The first thing I heard that I wasn't meant to hear came one afternoon when I stayed in the room longer than expected. They didn't notice. My name came up in the third person, spoken the way you refer to a complication, not a partner. The concern wasn't about how I would feel. It was about how something would look. Timing mattered. Presentation mattered. There was discussion about alignment, about avoiding unnecessary disruption. The word manageable was used, and it landed with a chill I didn't yet allow myself to feel fully. I felt no shock, no urge to interrupt, just a sharp, clarifying calm. That was when I understood why I still needed to do nothing. I didn't know how far this extended. I didn't know who else was involved. Acting on partial information would have alerted them that their assumptions were wrong, and assumptions, I realized, were the foundation of everything they were building. They assumed I was fragile. They assumed I was overwhelmed. They assumed I would eventually break the silence with emotion instead of action. So I let them assume. Their confidence grew in response. My husband became more open, less guarded. He spoke with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was inevitable. The mistress mirrored that confidence, her presence more assertive now, her language filled with plans and futures that did not include me. She had stopped watching her tone. She had stopped checking his reactions before speaking. Certainty had given her permission to be careless. I presented myself as detached. I canceled commitments without explanation. I appeared disengaged in conversations that once would have drawn my focus. I became, in their eyes, someone already stepping away. It was the perfect disguise. One detail changed everything. It was small enough to be missed, but specific enough to matter. A date mentioned twice in different contexts. A phrase repeated verbatim, too precise to be coincidence. A reference to something that shouldn't have existed yet. I felt the shift immediately. That detail could be verified. That detail could be traced. Listening was no longer enough. I began to take notes, not on paper, but mentally, aligning pieces that had once felt unrelated. I tracked how often certain names appeared together, how authority was implied rather than stated, how responsibility moved without announcement. I learned where confidence became sloppy, where certainty led to shortcuts. They believed they had control because nothing challenged them. They didn't understand that control requires opposition to be tested. Without it, mistakes multiply quietly. The more they relaxed, the more visible the structure became. I saw how decisions were layered, how approval flowed, how outcomes were assumed before processes were complete. I saw where things had moved too fast, where protocol had been treated as a formality rather than a requirement. I also saw how thoroughly they believed I was done. That belief was the greatest advantage I had. By the time they noticed I wasn't asking questions anymore, it was too late to wonder why. Silence had been normalized. My absence from conversations had been accepted as relief. They thought writing me out had simplified things. What it had actually done was give me a clear view of the system that replaced me. And systems, unlike people, leave tracks. The day I recognized that, I stopped pretending not to see them. I stopped reacting to what was being taken and started focusing on what was being mishandled. I stopped thinking about defense and started thinking about exposure. They thought my silence meant I had nothing left. What it meant was that I was done giving away information. From that moment on, I followed one rule. I would not reveal what I knew until the moment it mattered. And when it did, it wouldn't be in a private conversation. It would be somewhere they couldn't control the room. The day it happened felt too orderly to be accidental. Everything moved according to a schedule I hadn't been invited to help create. Conversations were brief, efficient, rehearsed. There was no tension in the air, no raised voices, no visible conflict. That absence should have been comforting. Instead, it made my chest tighten with the certainty that something irreversible was about to occur. I recognized the feeling because I'd felt it before, years earlier, when a decision had already been made, and the meeting that followed was only meant to formalize it. That morning, I tried to access something I had managed countless times before. Not out of suspicion, out of habit. The motion was automatic, muscle memory guiding my hands before my mind caught up. Access denied. The message was polite, almost apologetic, as if the system itself regretted delivering it. I tried again, assuming a temporary glitch. The same result. No error, no explanation, just a quiet refusal. I didn't panic. I didn't call anyone immediately. I sat still for a moment and let the reality settle, because reacting too quickly would have given away more than I was ready to reveal. When I asked about it later, the response came smoothly. There had been a change, a restructuring. Nothing personal, just a necessary adjustment while things were being clarified. I was told it was temporary, that it didn't reflect on me, that this was simply how these situations were handled. Situations like ours. The phrasing mattered. It placed me in a category, not a conversation. It framed my removal as policy rather than choice. What struck me wasn't the decision itself, but the way it was delivered. There was no hesitation, no negotiation, no attempt to soften the impact. It wasn't presented as something we needed to discuss. It was presented as something that had already been done. Notification, not dialogue. After that, the tone changed. People stopped asking for my input altogether. Explanations became shorter, more procedural. Phrases like moving forward and for now replaced anything resembling reassurance. I was no longer being managed emotionally. I was being managed administratively. And that told me everything. It wasn't just access that had been removed, it was authority. I could feel the shift in the way I was spoken to, in the way conversations angled away from me rather than toward me. There was a new finality in the language, a confidence that no longer bothered to hide itself. This wasn't temporary. This was removal. For the first time, all the fragments aligned. The meetings I hadn't been invited to, the documents finalized without my name, the language about transitions and timelines, the careful avoidance of direct confrontation. They weren't pushing me out emotionally. They were writing me out. The other woman made no effort to conceal her confidence anymore. She moved through shared spaces with an ease that assumed permanence. She spoke about future arrangements without checking whether I was listening. She referred to things as settled that had never been discussed with me. She believed the outcome was sealed. That belief didn't come from arrogance alone. It came from assurance. Someone had made her feel safe enough to stop pretending. I watched her carefully, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She had been given certainty, and certainty always comes from power. There was a private conversation later that day that confirmed what I already knew. No witnesses, no raised voices, no accusations. Just a calm exchange that carried more weight than any argument could have. I was told that this was the best way forward, that prolonging uncertainty helped no one, that decisions had to be made, and they had been. The implication was clear. My role in those decisions was no longer required. "This is already decided," was the phrase that stayed with me. Not we decided, not we discussed. Already decided. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, I didn't ask for reconsideration. In that moment, something in me settled. I stopped thinking about preserving the relationship, or salvaging my position, or proving my worth. Those goals belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. What mattered now was timing. As the conversation ended, I noticed something small. A reference to a document I knew well. A date mentioned casually, without awareness of its significance. A procedural step described incorrectly, as if it were a formality rather than a requirement. It was a mistake. A minor one, on the surface. The kind people make when they move too quickly, when confidence outpaces caution. They assumed I wouldn't notice. They assumed that because my access had been removed, my understanding had been erased with it. I said nothing. I thanked them for clarifying. I accepted the explanation. I played the role they had already assigned me, the one that required compliance and quiet. But as I walked away, the shape of the next phase became clear. They thought writing me out would simplify everything. What it actually did was remove the last reason I had to protect them. For the first time since this process began, I wasn't reacting, I wasn't defending, I wasn't hoping for fairness. I was counting. Counting steps, counting errors, counting the distance between their certainty and the reality they had overlooked. The day I was officially written out was the day I stopped thinking like someone being removed. It was the day I started thinking like someone who understood exactly where the structure was weakest. And once you see that, the outcome stops feeling uncertain. It becomes a matter of waiting. I didn't rush after that. People expect urgency when something is taken from you. Panic, desperation, loud objections. I gave them none of it. I moved carefully, deliberately, as if I had accepted the new reality and was simply learning how to live inside it. That assumption made them careless. Once my authority was officially removed, they stopped guarding details around me. They spoke freely, believing I no longer had the standing to matter. In meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions were summarized casually afterward, stripped of nuance, delivered as conclusions rather than processes. I listened for what didn't match. Timelines that overlapped when they shouldn't, procedures described out of order, names mentioned alongside responsibilities they weren't qualified to hold. Small things, each defensible on its own, but together forming a pattern that felt rushed. Confidence had replaced caution. I noticed how often the word standard was used without reference, how often assumptions were presented as precedent. I noticed how quickly they moved to finalize things that usually took time. Speed had become the priority, not accuracy. That was the opening. I began reconstructing the structure they thought I no longer understood, not through access but through memory. I remembered how things were supposed to work, what approvals were required, what steps couldn't be skipped without consequence. I didn't need full access to see where corners were being cut. I let conversations drift, asked questions that sounded naive, framed as curiosity rather than challenge. Questions like how something would be documented, who was responsible for oversight, what the fallback plan was if timelines shifted. They answered without hesitation, because they believed the answers didn't matter anymore. Each response confirmed what I suspected. Assumptions had been made too early. Authority had been consolidated without proper validation. Things that required independent review were being treated as internal formalities. They believed certainty made procedure irrelevant. I started keeping track of dates. Not physically, not yet. I tracked them mentally, aligning statements with actions. I noticed when commitments were referenced before they existed, when outcomes were described as complete while steps remained unfinished. There was one conversation that stood out. It happened casually, over nothing that mattered. Someone mentioned a deadline that had already passed. Not a small one, a structural one, the kind that determines whether something is enforceable or merely assumed. They didn't notice the mistake. They moved on immediately, confident the detail was insignificant. I said nothing. That was the moment everything shifted from theory to confirmation. From then on, I stopped wondering if there was a way back. I stopped thinking about fairness or repair. Those concepts belong to systems that value balance. This one valued speed. Speed creates errors. The other woman was everywhere now. Visible, vocal, confident. She spoke as if authority had already transferred to her, as if the space I once occupied had been vacated cleanly and permanently. She didn't understand the structure she was stepping into. She believed proximity equaled power, that confidence would substitute for process. I watched her make the same mistake they all were making. She assumed that because I was quiet, I was gone. In truth, my silence had sharpened my focus. Without the need to defend myself, I could observe without distraction. Without the expectation of being consulted, I could evaluate outcomes without bias. They had built their certainty on the idea that I was irrelevant. They never questioned whether I was still aware. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years being the person who ensured things were done correctly, thoroughly, responsibly. I knew how fragile systems became when they relied too heavily on assumption. I knew how often confidence replaced verification. And I knew exactly what happened when timelines were compressed for convenience. They thought my removal made the process smoother. It made it sloppier. I noticed discrepancies in how information was shared externally versus internally. I noticed how explanations shifted depending on who was listening. I noticed how roles blurred when oversight was removed. Each observation added weight to a conclusion I had already reached. This wasn't going to collapse because of confrontation. It was going to collapse because it had been rushed. The realization didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me calm. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't reacting to loss. I wasn't measuring what I had been stripped of. I was looking forward, not backward, and what I saw was inevitable. I didn't need to intervene. I needed to wait. The mistake they made wasn't underestimating my resilience. It was underestimating my patience. They believed silence meant retreat. They believed absence meant ignorance. They didn't understand that the most dangerous position is not at the center of the room. It's just outside the frame, where you can see the whole picture without being seen yourself. By the time they realized something was wrong, it wouldn't be because I had spoken. It would be because the structure they rushed to build couldn't support the weight of their certainty. And when that happened, there would be no room left to control the outcome. Only a record of what they had overlooked. And my name, waiting exactly where it needed to be. The first official notice arrived on a morning that felt deliberately ordinary. No dramatic delivery, no warning, just an envelope placed carefully where I couldn't miss it, as if the act itself were meant to feel respectful. Inside was the confirmation of the final hearing date, framed as the natural conclusion of a process that had already decided who mattered. They believed I would read it with resignation. Instead, I read it with precision. The language was confident, almost casual. Timelines were referenced as if uncontested. Assumptions were embedded as facts. There was no room left in the narrative for resistance, only compliance. That told me everything I needed to know. They had moved from preparation to execution. Up until that point, my silence had been useful. Now it became essential. This wasn't the moment to react emotionally or signal concern. This was the moment to confirm what I already suspected and ensure there were no surprises left unaccounted for. I scheduled a meeting I had avoided until then. Not with friends, not with family, with someone whose job was to see through certainty and test it for weakness, someone who didn't care about personal history or emotional narratives, someone who understood how systems fail when confidence outpaces diligence. I didn't dramatize the situation. I laid out facts, timelines, language, patterns. I didn't frame myself as wronged. I framed myself as omitted. That distinction mattered. As I spoke, I watched their expression change, not to alarm, to interest. Certain phrases triggered questions, certain assumptions prompted pauses, details I had cataloged quietly now carried weight when placed in sequence. They didn't promise outcomes. They asked better questions. We talked about process, not fairness, about documentation, not intent, about what had been assumed versus what had been verified, about where speed had replaced caution and where authority had been consolidated prematurely. I didn't tell them everything at once. I let the structure reveal itself naturally, because structures speak louder when they're allowed to stand on their own. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been declared. No strategy announced, no confidence offered. But I could feel the shift. For the first time, my silence wasn't being misinterpreted. It was being understood. From that moment on, every interaction took on a different meaning. Conversations I had once dismissed became relevant. Casual remarks carried context. Assumptions were no longer invisible. They were evidence. I continued to behave exactly as expected. I didn't challenge decisions. I didn't ask for inclusion. I didn't signal awareness. If anything, I appeared more disengaged, more distant, as if the finality they had imposed had finally settled. That made them comfortable. Comfort breeds carelessness. My husband grew more open as the date approached. His certainty hardened into arrogance. He spoke about outcomes as if they were guaranteed, about timelines as if they belonged to him. He never once asked whether I was prepared. The other woman treated the hearing as a formality. She spoke about what came after, not what was happening now. She made plans aloud, assuming proximity to power was permanence. Neither of them noticed the subtle shift in how others spoke around me. The way language softened, then sharpened. The way people stopped assuming I was uninformed and started avoiding specifics in my presence. That avoidance told me more than any confession could have. In the days leading up to the hearing, I reviewed everything one last time. Not obsessively, methodically. I wasn't looking for new information. I was confirming alignment. There was no panic in me, no urgency, just a steady certainty that timing, not confrontation, would decide this. The night before I slept. Not restlessly, not fitfully. I slept the way you do when there's nothing left to prepare, when the outcome no longer depends on persuasion, but on whether the room can ignore what's already on record. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to disappear, nothing that demanded attention, nothing that signaled performance. I wanted to look exactly like the person they expected to see. The woman who would listen quietly. The woman who would lose gracefully. When we arrived, the dynamic was unmistakable. His side was confident, composed, already celebrating in small ways. Laughter was shared softly. Reassurance passed easily between them. They believed this was the end. I took my seat alone. No show of support, no visible preparation, no signals that anything had changed since the last time they saw me retreat. That was intentional. The judge entered and the room shifted into formal stillness. Papers were arranged, postures adjusted. Everyone settled into the role they believed they had been assigned. As proceedings began, I felt the familiar sensation of being underestimated. It no longer stung, it steadied me. I watched the judge listen. I watched the pauses. I watched where attention lingered and where it moved on quickly. This wasn't about persuasion. It was about recognition. As arguments were presented, I could feel their confidence peak. This was the version of the story they had rehearsed. The one where silence equaled absence and absence equaled defeat. They didn't know that silence, when timed correctly, becomes presence. They didn't know that the structure they rushed past had already been rebuilt, quietly, somewhere they no longer controlled. And as the final exchanges drew closer, as certainty settled heavily over their side of the room, I understood something with absolute clarity. The outcome wouldn't turn on what I said. It would turn on what they had assumed no one would notice. And in a room where assumptions are weighed against records, that difference changes everything. The laughter came before the ruling. It slipped out softly, controlled, the kind of sound meant to be shared only with people who already believe the ending is theirs. My husband leaned toward his mistress, shielding his mouth with practiced ease, and whispered something that made her smile widen just enough to notice. She didn't look at me when she laughed. She didn't need to. The confidence in their posture told the story they thought was unfolding. Shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely, a certainty so complete it no longer required performance. Around them, quiet nods and exchanged glances confirmed the shared assumption that this was a formality, not a decision. I stayed still. The judge listened without expression, eyes moving between pages, pen resting lightly in his hand. He asked a question that sounded procedural, almost bored. My husband's attorney answered quickly, eager to keep momentum. The response was smooth, rehearsed, confident. Too confident. The judge paused. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't draw attention, just a fraction of a second longer than expected. He looked down again, then to the side, as if confirming something that had already been flagged. The room didn't notice. The arguments continued, layered with certainty and assumption. Language was polished. Timelines were stated as facts. Authority was implied, not demonstrated. Each point leaned on the last, creating a structure that looked solid because no one had tested its foundation. My husband glanced back at me once, briefly, his expression a mixture of irritation and dismissal. He believed I was watching my own erasure. He believed silence meant surrender. The judge asked another question. This one landed differently. It wasn't about intent. It wasn't about fairness. It was about sequence, about order, about whether certain steps had occurred before others were assumed complete. The attorney hesitated. Just a breath, barely perceptible. Then an answer came, confident but slightly off. A clarification followed, offered quickly, as if speed could correct precision. The judge didn't respond immediately. He flipped to a page marked with a tab. He adjusted his glasses. He read silently for a moment longer than comfort allows. The sound of pages turning filled the space where certainty had been. I felt the shift before anyone else did. The laughter stopped. The mistress's smile tightened, no longer easy. My husband straightened, attention snapping forward, sensing something had changed but not yet understanding what. The judge spoke again, his voice measured, neutral, almost gentle. He asked my name. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. For a moment, no one reacted. It was as if the room needed a second to process the disruption. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. My name wasn't part of the script they had rehearsed. I answered calmly. The judge asked me to stand. I did, slowly, without haste or hesitation. I didn't look at my husband. I didn't look at her. I focused on the bench, on the file open in front of him, on the place where records speak louder than assumptions. He asked a question that no one else had thought to ask. A simple one, about documentation, about acknowledgement, about whether something had been verified or merely presumed. The answer didn't come quickly this time. My husband's attorney began to speak, then stopped. The judge raised a hand, not unkindly, signaling that the response wasn't needed yet. He turned another page. The room was silent now, not the attentive silence of a courtroom waiting its turn, but the uneasy silence that follows a crack in certainty. The judge addressed the room, not me specifically, and summarized what he had found. He spoke of omissions, not accusations, of assumptions, not intent, of sequence and verification and the difference between authority exercised and authority documented. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't scold. He simply explained. As he spoke, I watched realization ripple across the other side of the room. Confusion first, then calculation, then the unmistakable flicker of concern. The mistress looked at my husband, searching for reassurance that didn't come. His jaw tightened. His confidence faltered, replaced by the brittle stillness of someone recalculating too late. The judge looked back at me. He asked one final question, one that framed everything that had been overlooked. I answered. Not defensively, not emotionally, just truthfully. When he nodded, it wasn't approval, it was confirmation. The ruling itself was delivered without flourish. No dramatic language, no moralizing. Just a clear correction of what had been assumed. Boundaries re-established. Authority recognized where it had been omitted. The words landed quietly, but the impact was immediate. The laughter that had opened the hearing felt distant now, almost embarrassing in retrospect. My husband stared straight ahead, expression blank, as if refusing to acknowledge the shift might undo it. The mistress looked down, suddenly aware of how exposed certainty can become when it's misplaced. I sat down as instructed. The judge moved on, already transitioning to the next matter on his docket. For him, this was procedure. For me, it was the moment when silence proved its worth. No one looked at me as proceedings concluded. Conversations stalled. Papers were gathered without urgency. The room emptied slowly, carefully, as if people needed time to recalibrate their understanding of what had just happened. I didn't rush to leave. I gathered my things with the same calm I'd maintained throughout. When I stood, I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because the truth had finally been allowed into the room. As I walked toward the exit, I passed them without comment. There was nothing left to say. The victory wasn't in the ruling itself. It was in the moment they realized their certainty had been built on silence they never bothered to understand. And by the time they did, it was already too late. The hallway outside the courtroom felt narrower than it had before, as if the walls had shifted closer while everyone was still pretending nothing had changed. People avoided my eyes. Conversations started and stopped in fragments. Words swallowed mid-sentence when I passed. The confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier had drained away, replaced by careful movement and controlled silence. No one rushed. No one celebrated. The air carried the unmistakable weight of recalculation. My husband stepped out last. He didn't look angry. That surprised me. He looked unsettled, the way someone does when the ground beneath them moves without warning. His certainty hadn't shattered dramatically. It had cracked quietly, leaving him standing in a version of the world that no longer matched the one he had prepared for. The mistress followed a few steps behind him. Her posture was different now, less assured. She kept her eyes forward, as if not looking at me might preserve something she didn't yet know how to name. The future she had been so comfortable stepping into had suddenly lost its outline. No one spoke to me. That, too, was telling. When people know they've misjudged you, they don't rush to apologize. They retreat. They reassess. They try to understand where they went wrong without admitting it out loud. Silence becomes a form of self-protection. I walked past them without stopping. Outside, the light felt sharper, almost intrusive after the controlled stillness of the courtroom. I stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the street wash over me, grounding myself in the ordinary details that had nothing to do with what had just happened. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't overwhelmed, I felt clear. The phone in my hand buzzed once, then again. Messages I didn't open, missed calls I didn't return. There would be time for that later. Right now, I needed to understand what the ruling meant beyond the words that had been spoken. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They arrived in fragments over the days that followed. A meeting postponed without explanation. A conversation that suddenly required written confirmation. A tone shift in messages that once assumed authority and now sought alignment. People who had been decisive became cautious. People who had spoken freely began choosing their words carefully. The structure that had felt so solid just a week earlier now moved as if it were being tested from all sides. My husband reached out once. Not to argue, not to apologize, to feel out where things stood. His message was neutral, almost polite, as if we were two professionals navigating a shared inconvenience rather than two people whose lives had just diverged publicly. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. The power dynamic had already shifted, and both of us knew it. He wasn't reaching out to negotiate terms. He was reaching out to understand what leverage, if any, he still had. That question answered itself when days passed without resolution. The mistress disappeared from view entirely. No public presence, no shared appearances. Whatever certainty had buoyed her before had evaporated, leaving behind distance and quiet. People like her don't stay when outcomes become unpredictable. They retreat, preserving what remains of their dignity. I didn't follow any of it closely. I didn't need to. The real aftermath wasn't about watching them unravel. It was about what happened internally, in spaces that didn't require witnesses. It was about waking up without the low-grade tension I'd carried for years, about making decisions without wondering who would reinterpret them later. For the first time in a long while, my name existed without qualification. No longer his wife, no longer a complication, no longer an assumed presence. Just my name, attached to my own authority, recognized without explanation. I thought often about the moment my name had been called in that courtroom. Not because it felt triumphant, but because it felt accurate. That was the difference. Revenge stories are usually told as explosions, dramatic confrontations, public humiliation, clear winners and losers. This wasn't that. This was quieter, more precise, a correction rather than a punishment. What they lost wasn't taken from them. It was withdrawn. And what I regained wasn't something new. It was something that had always been mine, temporarily obscured by assumptions I had allowed to stand for too long. There were moments, later, when I wondered how close I had come to losing everything simply by staying silent without intention. Silence alone doesn't protect you. Silence without awareness becomes erasure. The difference was timing. I hadn't waited forever. I had waited long enough. People began treating me differently. Not warmly, not coldly, carefully. That care wasn't kindness. It was recognition. Recognition that I was no longer someone whose presence could be managed or ignored. That recognition followed me into rooms I hadn't entered in a long time. It showed up in the way questions were asked, in the way assumptions were paused before being spoken. It wasn't satisfying in the way people imagine revenge to be. It was stabilizing. As weeks passed, the noise around the situation faded. New distractions took its place. Other stories demanded attention. That, too, was expected. Systems move on quickly once they've adjusted. What remained was quieter. A steady sense of alignment. of no longer bracing for the next quiet removal or unspoken decision, of knowing that when my name appeared on a page, it belonged there. That was the real outcome. Not the ruling itself, but the restoration of something fundamental. The understanding that I didn't need to announce my strength for it to matter. All I needed was the right moment. And when that moment came, it spoke for me. The quiet after the ruling stayed with me longer than the sound of the judge's voice. It followed me out of the courthouse, down the steps, into the open air where people moved on with their lives as if nothing remarkable had happened. Cars passed. Someone laughed across the street. The world didn't pause for closure. It never does. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the ordinary, letting it ground me. There was no rush to call anyone, no need to explain. The weight I had been carrying didn't vanish all at once, but it loosened, enough for me to feel my shoulders drop for the first time in years. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt accurate. The ruling hadn't given me something new. It had returned something that had been quietly taken and publicly assumed to be gone. My name, my standing, my place in decisions that had once been made without me. Inside the courtroom, certainty had collapsed without drama. Out here, the consequences began their slower work. Over the next days, the shift became unmistakable. Messages changed tone. Conversations that once spoke over me now circled carefully, as if aware that assumptions carried risk. People who had been comfortable deciding for me began asking questions they hadn't bothered with before. Authority doesn't announce itself when it returns. It settles in quietly, like something that never truly left. I didn't watch my husband closely after that. I didn't need to. The distance spoke for itself. When certainty is stripped away, people reveal what they relied on to feel powerful. Some double down, some disappear, some search for a way to rewrite the story. He tried, briefly, to reframe things, to speak as if this were a misunderstanding rather than a correction. But the language no longer worked. Once the truth is on record, it doesn't bend easily. The mistress vanished from the picture without explanation. No confrontation, no closure, just absence. She had stepped into a future that existed only as long as certainty held. When it didn't, there was nothing left to stand on. I didn't take pleasure in that. What mattered to me was the stillness that followed, the way my days began to feel like my own again. The absence of that low, constant vigilance that comes from knowing decisions are being made around you, not with you. I rebuilt quietly. Not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in small, deliberate choices. Saying yes when it felt right, saying no without apology, trusting my own timing again. I thought often about the version of myself who sat silently while others laughed, convinced they had already won. I didn't judge her. She did what she needed to do to survive long enough to see clearly. Silence, I learned, is not weakness. It's a tool. But like any tool, it only works when used with intention. Silence without awareness lets others decide your story. Silence with patience gives you time to understand the rules before you play. The real lesson wasn't about revenge, it was about restraint. About knowing when to speak and when to let the system expose itself. About recognizing that power doesn't always belong to the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the one who understands how the room works. I didn't win because I argued better. I didn't win because I embarrassed anyone. I won because I waited long enough to let assumptions become evidence. That kind of victory doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like peace. There are still moments when I think about how easily things could have gone differently. How close I came to being erased simply by trusting the wrong version of quiet. That thought doesn't scare me anymore. It steadies me. Because now I know what to listen for. I know the sound of certainty that hasn't been earned. I know the language people use when they believe no one is paying attention. And I know the power of having your name called at exactly the right moment. If you've ever been underestimated because you stayed calm, because you didn't shout, because you chose patience over noise, you're not alone. Sometimes the strongest move isn't reacting at all. It's watching, learning, waiting. And if this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment where staying quiet turned out to be the smartest choice you made? Share it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. If you want more real stories about justice, betrayal, and the kind of revenge that doesn't need to raise its voice, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this space where silence has meaning and patience has power. Because sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't loud. It's when your name is finally called, and the room has no choice but to listen.